Today, I want to start with a game. Something totally different, something out of the ordinary, but I'm going to need a volunteer for this game, and this volunteer must love ice cream. Anyone want to volunteer? All right, come on up here. Oh, I was going to go for Noah, but Noah, come on up. All right, so everyone, I want you to meet Noah. Noah, what grade are you in? Going into ninth grade? Cool. Come stand over here for everyone to see. Are you nervous? Cool. Darn. All right, you know Klondike bars, right? All right, everyone know the slogan for a Klondike bar? Right? What would you do for a Klondike bar? Today, we're going to find out what Noah's going to do for a Klondike bar, all right? So I'm going to give you a couple options. I don't want to just say you are doing this because that's not fair. I mean, my rule is I wouldn't do anything that you wouldn't, or you wouldn't do anything I wouldn't do. So everything that I'm about to give, I would do on stage at some point, and maybe I will. I don't know. But here are your options. Do you want to do the song and motions to I'm a Little Teapot? Do you want to dance to no music, just like a maniac on stage here for 15 seconds? No. All right. How about tell a joke? Would you like to tell a joke? How about do 10 push-ups? 10 push-ups, all right. There you go, go for it. Let's do 10 push-ups. Everyone count for them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't know if that last one counted. Everyone give it up for Noah. Here, have a Klondike bar. Thank you. See, here's what I love about Klondike Bar. When I looked at Klondike Bar's website, they talked about how the iconic Klondike Bar jingle asking, what would you do for a Klondike bar, has always been their way to challenge people to simply say yes, to have a moment of spontaneous fun. After all, spontaneous fun makes life a little bit sweeter. So whether it's challenging you to do a silly dance in public or tell a knock-knock joke at the DMV, it's because that letting loose and having fun is fundamental. If it takes a little risk of looking a little ridiculous, go and be spontaneous and show us what you would do for a Klondike bar. I think we all enjoyed watching Noah do some push-ups on stage. I don't know. I think that was a little fun, but isn't it crazy what this slogan, what would you do for a Klondike bar, has challenged people to do just fun little stupid stuff. You can go online and Google this and just see people do stupid little challenges for a Klondike bar. It makes life just a little bit better. But here's the thing is, what if the stakes of what we're trying to get better isn't an ice cream treat? What if what we're trying to get better is we're trying to make our job better? What are we willing to do to make our job better? What if you're trying to get your friends to like you more? Or maybe your family to spend a little bit more time with you? What if you were trying to get your biggest dreams to come true? What would you do for these things to happen? And I know that this might be totally crazy, so just hang in there with me for a second. But let's be real. What if you hated someone so much that you just had to do something about it? What would you do? And when I say hate, I'm not talking about I don't really like them. I'm talking when you think about this person, your blood starts boiling up and you get tense and you get angry. This person, it just makes your blood boil. We're in the series, it's called Crooked Sticks, and the idea comes from a quote attributed to Martin Luther that says, God can use crooked sticks to draw straight lines. And often this quote is attributed to people. God can use crooked people to do his plan. And today, I want to twist that just a little bit, and I want to focus more on a crooked situation where we're all crooked people. Right? We're not perfect people, but this person was just stuck in crooked situations. Today, this person couldn't catch a break from him. In fact, he was hated so much by his brothers that his brothers were plotting to kill him. He was wrongfully accused and imprisoned for things that he never did. He was forgotten about people that were his only hope to being saved. The person we're going to look at today, his name is Joseph, and his story takes place in the final part of the book of Genesis. So today we're going to start in Genesis 37, and there's a lot of story here. So I'm not going to read through it all. I'd encourage you guys, it takes place over the rest of the book of Genesis there, to go and read it on your own time. But for now, if you got a Bible, feel free to turn with me there. If you got the app on your phone, follow along in the sermon notes, or you can follow along on the screens behind me. So today, in chapter 37, starting in verse 2, we see Joseph introduced. He's a young boy at the age of 17, and he had a job as a shepherd, looking over his father's flocks along with his brothers. But by verse 3, we see things take a downward dive for Joseph. 3 verses into the chapter. Take a look. Now Israel, this is Joseph's father Jacob, loved Jacob more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his long age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw this, that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Now, quick show of hands. How many of you have siblings? All right. How many of you are the favorite sibling? I saw a lot of hands go down. All right. At least we're a little self-aware there. I know I was my parents' favorite sibling. They always said they loved us the same, but let's be honest. But I totally believe them. I believe my parents loved me and my brother the same, just different types of love at different times. But in this case, we see that Joseph is the favorite sibling. His father liked him more. It says it right there because he was born in his old age. We see that he made a special robe for him, an ornate robe. This is often translated to a colorful, vibrant, just if you've seen the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, that's where you see this Technicolor robe that his father gave him. And then after a little bit later in the passage, we see Joseph have a couple of dreams. Take a look. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, and suddenly my sheath rose and stood upright, while your sheaves rose around mine and bowed down to it. Then he had another dream, and he told his brothers, "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now, Joseph decides to tell his brothers about these dreams that he had, and my guess would be that the already hatred that his brothers had for him, this would have fueled that a little bit more. Like, man, I had these dreams. You guys were worshiping me. It was pretty cool. No, but my first thought is, why would you tell your brother these things? I mean, they already don't like you. Was Joseph trying to be cocky or just kind of egg his brothers on as siblings do to each other? Or was Joseph really just dumb? Was he just that naive? What was Joseph thinking here? And honestly, I don't think either of these are the case, and here's why. I don't believe that he was cocky because this isn't reflected across Joseph's character anywhere else in the story. He's not a cocky person. I mean, he probably wasn't even dumb or naive either. I mean, many of us have dreams, right? Most of our dreams don't come true. So, I mean, it's just a dream. I'm going to share about my life with my siblings. Instead, I think the issue laid with the brothers. The issue was the hatred and the envy and the anger that his brothers had for Joseph. And the hatred that they had led them to do abusive and wicked things to Joseph. So one day, Jacob sends Joseph to go be in the fields with his brothers. And as Joseph approaches his siblings, we see their hatred start to take action against him. In verse 18, we see this. But they saw him coming in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Then Reuben heard this, one of the brothers. He tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him in the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Now, if you don't know what a cistern is, that's all right. I got a picture up here for you. A cistern is a spot in the ground where they would dig out this giant hole to collect rainwater. There's a little drain here that you can see that would be what collects the rainwater. And then there's a stone cap on top. That cap was probably the most important part of the cistern. It would have kept the water from evaporating out. But more importantly, it would have kept people from getting in it and animals from falling in it. So Joseph's brothers intentionally removed this cap off the cistern to put him in. They stripped him from the robe that he was wearing. And we see the story continue on. And almost as nothing had happened. They go and they sit down for their meal and they look and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Galilee. Their camels were loaded with spice, balm, myrrh, and they were on their way down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So the Midianite merchants came by. His brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. So the brothers' plots went from murdering their brother to just selling him into slavery. And for them, this is probably a good deal. I mean, they get rid of their brother that they hate. They don't have the guilt of murdering their brother. And beyond that, they made a little bit of money out of it as well. The Midianites took Joseph and they sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials and the captain of the guard. All right, here's a quick question. Can you think of a time where someone's anger got the best of them? Maybe for you can think of a time where your anger got the best of you. As I was thinking of this moment, I was thinking back to when I was probably in preschool or kindergarten, really young. And my brother and we were out gardening with my dad one day, and I started getting annoyed by my brother. Do I remember what he was doing? No, probably just brother things. I mean, brothers are annoying, right? But we were out gardening, and this is back in the day when they actually had real gardening tools for kids, not like the plastic things. They were like metal. And I don't know who came up with this, but after a while, I just got more and more irritated with my brother, and I took the gardening hoe and hit my brother in the back of the head with it. I don't know why that's funny, but so that made for a really fun trip to ER. But here's the point, is that my brother didn't deserve that. I mean, he's just being a brother. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong necessarily. It was the anger that I had that put him in that crooked situation. Going back to Joseph, though, in chapter 39, we see Joseph start to prosper while he was there in slavery. We see him at Potiphar's house, and scripture says this: Joseph found favor in his eyes and become his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From that time, he was put in charge of his household and all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptians because of Joseph. The blessings of the Lord was with everything Potiphar had, both in the house and on the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food that he ate. What a great life Potiphar has, right? He only has to care about what he eats. That's great. He doesn't have to worry about who's going to do the gardening and who's going to go do all these little tasks around the house. No, he didn't concern himself with anything. And that goes on for a little while there. But then we see Joseph's life have another turn. We see this when Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her, saying, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph refused, and he replied in this way: "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in this household. Everything he owned has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this household than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph didn't cave to the pressure that Potiphar's wife was putting on him. Instead, he said, "This can't happen. I'm going to remain faithful to my master." But the encounter doesn't stop there. He was doing his job one day at the house, probably as he's done 1,000 times before. And Potiphar's wife tries to come to him again, saying, "Come to bed with me." But this time, Joseph flees, but not without his cloak. See, take a look at what happened. She kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. She told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar has a justified response if the story was true. He was livid, and he has Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph was accused for something he's never done. Anyone ever been accused of something they never done? I have. When I was in second grade, we had an end of the school picnic. It was our favorite time of the year because it was a cookout. And it was the same hot lunch hamburgers that were super dry and gross. But we got to eat them outside. We got ice cream with it, and we got fresh watermelon. So that makes for automatically a better lunch. And while we're having lunch at this time, there's a bunch of kids just throwing their food around. You know, food fight, last day of school. That wasn't quite the last day of school, but pretty close. And so we were I wasn't a part of it. And I got caught in the crosshairs. I got hit with one of those cartons of milk, you know, the ones that are impossible to open. Yeah, and I got hit with that, and I'm just dripping in chocolate milk. Not a good day. So I stand up, and as I stand up, the lunch lady sees me covered in chocolate milk. And so now I'm on my way down to the principal's office with all these kids that were throwing food. And for the next day, the last day of school, I got to eat lunch with the principal. I didn't do anything wrong. I just got hit with the milk. Whatever. I wasn't involved, but I still got in trouble for it. Just as Joseph didn't do anything wrong, he still faced the consequences. But while he was in prison, take a look at what happens next. But while he was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he made him responsible for all that he had done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Again, Joseph, in the middle of these crooked situations, in prison for something he didn't do, found God's favor and was blessed through his time in prison. While he was there, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker were also thrown into prison with him. And they had a couple of dreams. And while I don't want to go into too much detail here about those dreams, you can read them in chapter 14. But the dreams were quite confusing to them. They needed someone to interpret them. And Joseph goes, "I got you. I'll help you out." And the general gist of the dreams was that the cupbearer was going to be restored to his position, back with the king, and the baker was going to be put to death. And both of these things came true. Joseph told the cupbearer, though, as a part of his interpretation, "But when all goes well for you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon." Joseph interprets these dreams, says, "Remember me." That didn't happen. Once the cupbearer was let out, he forgot about Joseph. It wasn't until 2 years later when Pharaoh had a dream that the cupbearers, "Oh shoot, I remember something that I should have remembered a long time ago. When I was in prison, there was a guy, he interpreted my dream and that baker's dream, and he told me that I was going to be restored and the baker was going to be put to death, and both things came true." So Pharaoh sends for Joseph. He says, "I had a dream that no one can interpret, but I've heard it said that you can." Joseph replies to Pharaoh saying, "I can't, but God can." So Pharaoh goes on to tell Joseph about his dream, something about how there's 7 ugly, lean cows, not healthy, who end up eating 7 healthy, strong cows. and 7 thin grains of head swallowed up by 7 healthy grains, or swallowing up 7 healthy grains. And these dreams ended up being the same dream. They ended up being having the same meaning, that there was going to be 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. There's going to be 7 years where you're going to have plenty of food. You're going to have more than enough food, followed by 7 years where there's not going to be enough. And they had an awesome warning time on this. So Joseph tells Pharaoh, you need to put someone in charge of this, of collecting food for this time of famine that we're about to endure. So Pharaoh says this to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning or as wise as you. You shall be put in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Joseph is finally out of these crooked situations that he's been in. He was abused and sold into slavery by his siblings because they had hatred for him. He was imprisoned and accused for crimes that he didn't commit. He did this great thing for a friend in prison and says, remember me. And it wasn't until 2 years later where he was finally remembered. We took and went through this in the past 15 minutes, but for Joseph, this took 17 years. Now, I was trying to put in perspective what 17 years looks like. So here are a couple of the major headlines from 2006. That was 17 years ago. In Mumbai, there was a train blast that killed many on July 11th. The crocodile hunter died on September 4th of 2006. In October of 2006, Google bought out YouTube for $1.65 billion, and Pluto was reclassified as a dwarf planet. Those are just 4 of the headlines that I personally could remember. Maybe for you, you hear 2006, oh man, what happened in 2006? And there's something that stands out to you and you're like, 17 years? That was 17 years ago? Wow, that seems like forever ago. And this was how long that Joseph was just stuck in these crooked situations. In the following chapters, 42 through 47, we see Joseph being re-encountered with his siblings. And there's a lot there, but basically, they were coming to Egypt to come find food. They didn't have food. They were a part of this famine that was happening. Joseph recognized his brothers, but his brothers did not recognize him. And so Joseph goes on to test his brothers. He says, you guys are spies. You're here just to steal food. Joseph was testing his brothers just to make sure they weren't going to be the same people that they were years ago from their youth. And once they pass all these tests, Joseph invites them to come live with him in Egypt, them and their family, and be reunited together. This story has a pretty happy ending, all things considered. It took a long time to get there, though. 17 years plus to get there. But as I was reading through this passage and studying this passage, there were 3 things that stood out to me. The first thing is that Joseph was able to forgive. Joseph forgave on many occasions throughout this experience, but the most obvious was with his brothers. And before I dive any further into this, I'm not going to go super deep into forgiveness because forgiveness could be its own series in and of itself. But in Genesis 50, Jacob died. Joseph's father had died, and the brothers were scared that somehow he would have a grudge against them, make him pay him back for the things that they've done wrong over the years. I mean, after all, that's why he was sold into slavery. That's why he faced all these years of crooked situations. But Joseph assures his brothers, he says this, don't be afraid, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke to them kindly. Here's the hard part. I don't know who needs to hear this today, but you can start forgiving today. And I get that this can be difficult because every person and every situation is different. But before I mention more about forgiveness, let me say what forgiveness is not. I stole this from our winter retreat speaker from this past winter because he gave 5 things that forgiveness isn't. And I thought they were phenomenal. They stuck with me. The first one is that forgiveness isn't a scoreboard. It's not where this person hurt me 6 times and I'm only on 5, so I got to get them back one more time before we're even. That's not what forgiveness is. It's not about forgetting. You're not going to forget the pain and the hurt that you went through. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's not about trust. I will forgive you when I trust you again. That's not forgiveness, because trust can come back in a long time after a hurt, or maybe it'll never come back to the same place it was before. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there's going to be consequences. There's going to be no consequences. If you are forgiven, you might still have to face the consequences of the actions that had happened. And finally, forgiveness isn't just a feeling. Oh, I feel like forgiving now. Now I can forgive you. Because truly, forgiveness is hard because it's a feeling of anger and bitterness towards people. The truth is that people don't deserve forgiveness. We can hold on to that hurt and that anger and the bitterness that we have towards people, but ultimately, in the long run, that's going to hurt you more than the other people. It's going to eat you apart. Forgiveness is a gift of grace that we can receive. When we see Joseph re-encounter his brothers, we see him test them. He remembers what his brothers had done to him. We don't see him trying to take revenge, though, and get back and say, oh, now we're going to be even. I don't know if the trust was there 100%. And quite frankly, I don't know if Joseph would have felt like forgiving either. It was because of God, though, that he was able to. That forgiveness is the same thing that we're called to. So if we're talking about forgiveness, what is it? There's no better forgiveness than what comes from God. In Romans 3:23 through 25, it says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is Christ Jesus, whom Jesus put forward as a prohibition by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. All of us are called in Colossians 3:13 to forgive just as God has forgiven us. And that forgiveness can be what sets us free. The second thing that stood out to me is that throughout this whole experience, God was in control. God had a plan of what he was going to do. And I hate to break this to you, but sometimes God's plan isn't going to line up with our plan. What God's plan isn't going to make us always feel comfortable, isn't always going to make us feel good. And if we're being honest with ourselves, I think there's times where we get in this mindset that I'm following God. Everything should be good. Things aren't good. Where's God in this moment? And we can get frustrated and angry. When we don't get the job that we're applying for, that we were really hoping for, when we are struggling because of our health or our finances, or we're struggling in our relationships or other crooked moments, we can get upset with God and question, where are you working? And I'm sure Joseph had many of these moments. But in the end, God's plan shined through. God's plan isn't always going to be our plan. Joseph faced a lot of crooked situations, and God gave him a gift to interpret dreams. From that age of 17, he had this dream of his brothers coming to worship him. But that same gift that God used, that his brothers hated him over, was the same gift that saved many people in Egypt to interpret the dream of the famine. I doubt Joseph would have known these things at the time he was sold into slavery, but by the end of it, it shined through. God's plan shined through because Joseph trusted that God was in control. And this leads me to the final thing. Because of these two things, because Joseph was forgiving and because God was in control, Joseph was able to actively accept the personal injustices that he faced. Let me just say that again, because that's a really uncomfortable term for us. He actively accepted personal injustice. The things that Joseph were facing were personal injustices. They were only tailored to him. And don't get me wrong, there's many things that take place on a wide scale of injustice, from racism to sexism to homelessness and all sorts of other things that affect a group of people. But personal injustices are for some reason harder for us to deal with because it's only applying to us. They were personal to Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery because he hated them. He was accused of crimes that he didn't commit and imprisoned for him. He was forgotten by the person that could have saved him. All of these things would have been personal attacks to Joseph, and in the midst of them, we don't see him lying there, moping around, saying, "Woe is me, my life sucks." Instead, we see him standing there saying, "This is where I am, and this is where I'm going to be going. I can stand in the trust that God is in control and face these things that I am going through." Listen, I don't know what personal injustices you might be facing right now. And I don't know what's going to come in the future. But through Joseph's story, we can see that Joseph was forgiving and we can be forgiving. I don't know who you need to forgive today. You can trust that God is in control. And when we are in the midst of these personal injustices, we can actively accept the personal injustices that we're facing. I was talking with Rick this week. I told him I wasn't going to throw this in the sermon, but it was convicting enough for me. So I just had to share it. Part of following Jesus is giving up our freedoms. And one of those freedoms is to push back and retaliate. When you are being pushed against, we don't have to get back at the other person. We see this perfectly exemplified through Christ's crucifixion. Jesus didn't deserve to be hanging on that cross. He didn't deserve to be whipped and tortured. He didn't deserve the injustice that he was facing. And in the midst of it all, he didn't retaliate at all. Jesus forgave those who were whipping him and beating him. Jesus trusted the plan that God had to save the world. Crooked situations are going to come up in our life. Where are you facing personal injustice? Where can you take a step back and forgive? Where can you say, "God, I trust you right now. I don't know what you're doing, but in the end, your plan is going to shine through." Will you pray with me? God, I want to thank you for sending your son to die for us, to be this perfect example for us of what it looks like to forgive. Perfect example of what it looks like that you are in the control in the midst of the worst of our situations. As Jesus hung there on the cross, being whipped, tortured, abused, unconditional love shined through. A love that only can be seen through you. So this week, with whatever we go through, personal injustice, struggles, whatever it is, let us see you shine through these moments. We ask these things in your name.